Welcome, I am so happy that you're here. There are some techniques from yoga, breath work, and also the bandhas, which is a really misunderstood practice, which usually is taken to mean locks, but we're also going to explore the unlocking mechanism. And the fascinating thing is that these bandhas really tally with the pathway of the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve has been shown to be able to stimulate healing of both the physical and mental health of the body. And this partly relates to stress. Stress has a massive part to play in obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, so some of those most prevalent health problems of our time, but also in easing anxiety and other mental health conditions. So by plugging together the breath work and the bandhas in a quite specific way, so it's more inclusive if you are anxious, we can help alleviate some of these problems. We're going to dive into these techniques over 3 days. Firstly, having a look at pelvic floor, moolah bandha, the root lock, and breathing down towards the pelvis. And since 50% of women also have pelvic floor problems and 16% of men globally, this can also be a solution in terms of pelvic floor health. And then secondly, on the second video, we'll explore more around the breath and looking at how the diaphragm also helps stimulate the vagus nerve, and then bringing that into movement, which we can share in a really easy, inclusive way. And then thirdly, we'll look at tying it in with some ease around the neck and the shoulders, and another area from yoga, the Jalandhara bandha, which again stimulates the vagus nerve. I'll explain a little bit more as we go through. So for now, we're going to start with some work around the pelvis. Let's come up to standing and we can just dive straight in together. You don't need to get changed, you don't need anything, just super simple practice. So we're going to take the legs a little bit open, maybe a bit wider than the pelvis, and let the knees bend. If you feel wobbly, put your hands onto a wall in front of you or a chair in front of you. And just imagine your feet connecting down to the ground and let your legs drop. Good. So your pelvis is quite broad, and if you imagine the muscles of the pelvic floor like a hammock, side to side, that's also broadening. Let your crown of your head reach up a little. Good, and just have a little bounce there. Now we're going to move inwardly from the hips. You're just going to move in and out and in and out. So the pelvis is fairly steady, and we're moving at the hip. And we're really just going to be freeing up a little bit the muscles around the hips and the pelvis without having to think too much about it. Good, straighten up for a moment. Let's take a breath in, let the arms lift up. And then as you breathe out, just bend your knees again and have another little bounce. So now we're going to come to sitting. And you can sit up onto some height if it's not super comfy for you to be on the ground, like a blanket or some cushions. You could even work from a chair. Let's have the hands behind us. Now, one thing that happens is we end up gripping in with the abdomen or hoiking up with the pelvic floor. And we often think in yoga, if you've got a yoga training, that this is going to help us. But what can happen with the pelvic floor muscles is that they get gripped and then they're not functioning well. So by giving some space and moving in different ways, we're going to see, can we invite more ease down to the pelvis? So firstly, I invite you to let go of the gripping in at the abdomen and the pelvic floor. And imagine that your breath is coming really wide out to the sides of your body, out to the side of the rib cage. If you imagine you have a accordion, you're breathing wide in that way. And then let's just start with the left leg tipping in and tipping out. Good. Keep imagining your breath is moving wide to the side, and we're just going to go in and out. And as you move your hip, imagine that the breath is allowed to drop down towards the pelvis. And this is because physically this happens. The diaphragm muscle all around the ribs sends some downward movement through the abdomen and to the pelvic floor. So the diaphragm and the pelvic floor move in sync if we let them. Let your hip just move in and out in time with your breath, or just as you breathe fully low into the body, as if breathing wide and down. 2 more. It doesn't matter how much your leg or your hip is moving, just as much as works for you in your body. Yeah, lovely. And then we're going to sit still for a moment, so you can sit up on some height or on a chair or on the floor if you've done lots of yoga, if you're feeling bendy in your hips. Good. And let's just simply let the hands come around the rib cage now. So you're going to hold the side of the ribs and feel like you're breathing wide into your hands. So when you're inhaling, you can maybe feel the sideways movement. And when you're exhaling, you're just going to feel the ribs come in a little closer. Take a couple more breaths in that exact way. And now feel as if that sideways movement corresponds to a downward movement through the pelvic floor. So we're letting go of any gripping in the pelvic floor. Good. You might want to let your hands go and just stay with that awareness. And what happens when we do this is that the abdomen and the pelvic floor work together as a functional unit. So it relates to our core stability because we can respond in movement in a functional way. Breathing down, feeling the pelvic floor lets go. And it also means if we've been habitually gripping, as the pelvic floor moves down, that also means the muscles are getting more functional. If you think about any muscle, it wants to be able to move through its full range of motion. If I could only move my bicep a little bit, I wouldn't be able to punch well or move effectively. It's just the same with the pelvic floor. So this practice in itself is a really key way to improving the tone of the pelvic floor. And it's also sending signals up through the vagus nerve, which has a branch which reaches into the pelvic floor. And that in turn is fantastic for our mental health. And we'll explore more on that tomorrow. Come back and join me, and in the meantime, enjoy these easeful movements through the pelvis and with your breath.